Good morning. I'm Dustin Gardner, co-author of Politico's California Playbook, and welcome to the Commonwealth Club's Forum on Proposition 50. We are on the outset of just a few weeks away from the November 4th special election for Proposition 50, which will ask voters to suspend California's independent redistricting commission and allow the Democratic-led legislature to redraw the state's congressional map. Now, let me talk a little bit more about the panelists that are here with us today. Cynthia Dye served on the state's very first redistricting commission that drew new legislative and congressional districts after the 2010 census. Trina Turner serves on the most recent Citizens Redistricting Commission that redrew the maps after the 2020 census. And Eric McGee is policy director and senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. So let's jump right in with our questions, and thank you to our speakers for being here today. Eric, I'd like to start with you. Let's do a vibe check about where we're at in this campaign. What does the most recent polling and the ballot return data suggest to you about how this race is shaping up? Are Democrats really on track to pull this thing off?
Yeah, so the polling has all been reasonably positive for Prop 50. Looks like it's kind of on track. It's not an overwhelming margin, so you would want to see maybe a slightly bigger one to ensure victory, but it's looking pretty good. I think any ballot return data at this point is probably a little too preliminary. We're really still very early in the process. Most of the ballots, even though we're only a few weeks out from the election, most of the ballots get submitted, in the last week or so, and then people will often go to the polls to drop them off.
And Eric, let's stay with you just for a second. I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. In this, California does not exist in a vacuum. This comes amid a big national redistricting fight. Can you just tell people watching today a little bit about how California got to this place of having this question on the ballot?
Yeah, so Donald Trump encouraged Texas to redraw its map to produce more Republican seats than it had at that time. And that prompted a reaction from Gavin Newsom in particular, our governor. And then the Democrats in the legislature and Gavin Newsom pushed to put this measure on the ballot as a response specifically to Texas. Now that it's not stopping there. There's Missouri has also, so Texas has actually passed its new map, and there's a lawsuit against it. But if that lawsuit is not successful, then that's the map that they'll use in 2026. Missouri has also passed a new map, and there's a variety of other states that are thinking about doing the same. And that's really where I think the rubber hits the road on this whole thing. The tit for tat between California and Texas, it probably wouldn't make too much difference in the national picture. But as you kind of start to spread to other states, then it can start to be talking about some real numbers.
Okay, well, thanks for giving us that foundation. I want to get into the campaign arguments here. The opposition against Prop 50, they've really focused on this idea of the central argument that two wrongs don't make a right. The notion that just because Texas gerrymandered their map, that California shouldn't follow them down that path. Cynthia Dye and Trina Turner, you both come at this from different angles. I'm curious, what you make of that question of two wrongs don't make a right. Let's start with Trina Turner. Why do you disagree with this this notion that Prop 50, or why do you agree with this notion that Prop 50 is essential to protect democracy? The argument that Governor Newsom has made.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Dustin. And I think fundamentally, typically, I would agree that two wrongs does not make a right. However, I find that we're at a very different place in our nation. And I want to say that I was extremely proud to have served and to currently serve as one of the redistricting commissioners with all of the built-in independence and transparency and hearing from our voters. But we have to be honest about the space in the time that we're in right now in our nation. And I believe that it's short-sighted for California at this point to only think about California. So that framing of the two wrongs, I think it's actually a wrong followed up by an adjusted right for California to engage based on what's happening throughout our nation.
And Cynthia Dye, you come at this from the opposite angle. You were part of the original redistricting commission, and you actually wrote one of the ballot arguments opposing Proposition 50. Why do you agree with that notion that two wrongs don't make a right, or why do you think this measure is the wrong direction for the state to be moving?
Well, a lot of my friends and colleagues are conflicted and confused by Prop 50, and that's not surprising. Democrats are now advocating for gerrymandering, and California Republicans are now upholding democratic principles. But from my experience on the commission, I can tell you that neither side wants to defend democracy. They just want to win. And my problem with 50 is that it gaslights voters. It says we will save democracy while it disenfranchises Californians, somehow justifying this authoritarian tactic because Texas disenfranchised Texans. And how does this make our nation more democratic? Remember that our democracy says that while majority rules, minority rights are protected. We just don't steamroll over them. 50 says that it will protect independent redistricting as it explicitly replaces a map drawn by over 36,000 Californians and bypasses the commission. It says that if we gerrymander just this once to counter Texas, we will save the nation, when all the math shows that we cannot make up for Florida, Missouri, Ohio, and all the other red states now jumping into the gerrymandering war. And more gerrymandering just adds fuel to the fire. It just leads to the kind of hyper-partisanship that shuts down governments. Because gerrymandering is not a partisan issue. Both parties love it when it benefits them, and they hate it when it doesn't. And before the commission, Democratic and Republican incumbents even colluded to ensure safe seats. And in California, I remember Democratic Governor Gray Davis and Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger both supported the Voters First Act because they had dysfunctional legislators that were held hostage by partisan extremists. So independent redistricting will always be opposed by the party in power because they want to stay in power.
Pastor Turner, do you want to respond to that? I mean, should people really believe this idea that this is temporary, or that this is merely a response to Republicans from the Democrats in Sacramento? I mean, is there a legitimate fear that this is, maybe a power grab on the Democrats' part as well?
Yes, I would definitely love to respond. I believe that the arguments are so fraught with issue and problem in that I believe this is a little bit bigger than just Democrats and Republicans. We're talking about lives here that are at stake. We're talking about trying to counterbalance what's going on in our congressional districts right now. So we know Congress is led by Republicans. And right now, every Republican that's seated has almost sworn an allegiance, it feels, to the current administration. I feel like what's going on right now is that we have lost every sense of check and balance that's supposed to happen in our nation. And because those that are seated in power, the Republicans that hold the majority right now, have failed to act on behalf of the nation, this is where now California has to recognize the time that we're in and do something a little bit different. This is about, over 36,000 voices called in, phoned in, participated in the process that we had in place. And I think indeed, if all things were equal, we'd be at that same place of wanting to uphold independent redistricting. However, at this point, we as Californians, and as far as taking voices from Californians, I think Prop 50 does just the opposite of that. Whereas in Texas, there was not the opportunity for the people to engage. In California, people will, and they are speaking out as to what they need. Just because the Californians voted back in 2008 for a 2010 cycle and a 2020 cycle to have independent redistricting based on what was going on in our nation, what's going on in our legislature at the time. The fact that they did that then, that's beautiful. But now things are changing, and we are giving Californians an opportunity to show up. They can show up and say, no, we don't want to change this, or they can show up and say yes, as many of them are already. They understand that they're speaking out not just because they want to gerrymander, they're speaking out because of the loss already that we're seeing through our health benefits. There are 3.1 million children, veterans, and families in California that's losing food off of their tables. Another 2.4 Californians going to lose access to health care due to Medicaid cuts, and now some impacts even to Medicare. We're seeing a National Guard come into our communities. All of this is an overreach from our administration. That is an overreach allowed because the courts nor Congress is standing up to be able to say, wait a minute, our everyday Californians, some of those same 36,000 that called in to voice their opinion, they're now not being recognized, they're not being taken into consideration with some of the sweeping cuts of our big, beautiful bill and different things that have put in place. And that was then. Currently, every day there's a new assault against our democracy. And so what Prop 50 says is that California, the bill would love for all of our states to have independent redistricting. However, until that happens, California can't keep its head in the sand and saying we want to stand on what was done before. We gave our commissions the opportunity to draw lines. We did. I'm proud of them. I'm proud of the work that was done. First cycle, second cycle. However, at this point, we have to do what it takes to counter the attack against democracy that is, we were saying before, slowly eroding. Now it's quickly eroding. And by the time we wait to 2030, if nothing is done, we won't have a democracy to protect.
I want to get into the legal implications and all the different, policy considerations you mentioned. But before we move on, Cynthia, do you want to respond one last time before we move on to another question?
Yes, I'd love to respond. And honestly, I'm in violent agreement with what Commissioner Turner has mentioned. I think it's abhorrent what's happening in the country. But I think this is like the biggest fallacy about 50. The proponents say that this is what we need to do to fight back. This is an emergency. This is how we stop Trump. But on November 5th, Trump will still be in office. He'll still be issuing executive orders. He will still be dismantling agencies created by Congress, halting funds appropriated by Congress, starting wars without the consent of Congress, and testing the limits of the judiciary. I just think it is a very ineffective solution if that is the goal. It will not fix the problem that has been stated.
Let's move on to the legal considerations here. There's already been about a half dozen lawsuits filed challenging Prop 50. Many of these have been from the Republican Party. And if the measure is to pass, there are sure to be more legal challenges. I want to ask all of you, starting with Eric, what are the odds that you think Prop 50 could be struck down by the courts? And is there anything that you see in the way that the measure is written that could provide some sort of legal firewall to prevent against court challenges? Eric, how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to say for sure what the prospects are. But the main things that you would normally think of would be a Voting Rights Act challenge, which honestly I don't see a lot from this proposed map that creates problems in that regard. But you never know. A lot of the other guardrails that might have existed. So, well, the other big thing is the districts all have to be equal in population, but that's pretty straightforward. The other constraints are all in kind of California law, and we're explicitly setting them to one side. So none of those are going to be available. There was a discussion at one point where the legislature would just draw a new map without any voter input. And that, I think, would raise quite a number of legal questions, but they decided not to go that route. So they're putting it on the ballot instead, which, could go badly for them, but that was the strategy they took. And then and other kinds of guardrails that you might imagine could exist, theoretically, simply don't. So the Supreme Court has explicitly said that it's okay to do mid-decade redistricting. The Supreme Court has explicitly said that they don't put any constraints on partisan gerrymandering at all. So there's no federal constraint on doing partisan gerrymandering or on doing a mid-decade redistricting, and that's just because the courts have sort of stepped out of that area quite explicitly. So I would say there could always be some other legal challenge. I don't want to take that off the table, but some of the big ones that you might think of don't seem to be really in play here.
Cynthia, what are your thoughts in terms of legal challenges? Do you think this thing could be vulnerable if it were to pass?
I believe the legislature got good legal advice. In California, we believe in direct democracy, like the ballot initiative, which is how we fired the legislature from drawing their own lines in the first place. Prop 50 proponents say this is a kinder, gentler gerrymandering because, unlike Texas, you get a vote on it. But the truth is you must vote on it because the Voters First Act was enacted by the people, and only the people can undo it without legal challenges. And I believe that's why we have Prop 50. So I don't think the courts will save us from ourselves.
Okay. Pastor Turner, do you want to add something here?
No, I was just going to say there's nothing fundamentally that would prevent the court from examining, what was done. But I do believe that all of the precautions that was mentioned was put in place, and I believe that it will stand. I believe, and it's my hope that it will.
Another central argument in this campaign from the opposition has been this notion, and Cynthia mentioned this earlier, this notion that this really won't be temporary, even though, Governor Newsom and Democrats have said that after 2030, after the 2030 census, the state will revert back to independent redistricting, that once this map is in place, that won't really happen because you'll have these new members of Congress, pressing to keep their districts. So I want to ask all of you, should voters believe that this really is temporary, and why or why not? Why don't we start with Pastor Turner on that one?
Yeah, I'd love to start on that one. I think the beauty of where we sit in California is that anything can happen. The proposition is written in a way that, yes, it is written into the very ballot measure that it will return. So that will happen. Now, we could not look into the future before to see what would happen, and we cannot look into the future now. Californians will still have the ability to exercise their constitutional rights to express their opinions based on whatever is going on. The ballot measure is written to where it will return 2030 back to independent redistricting. That is what I believe will happen. Everything in place says that it's what should happen. It's what I believe will happen. Now, 5 years into the future, 10 years into the future, I am excited that Californians have the same opportunity that they did now to lift their voice and decide to do something different based on whatever we're seeing in that current moment.
Cynthia, you seem skeptical about that idea that this is temporary. Why do you think voters should share that skepticism?
Yeah, I don't believe for a second that this is temporary. Many voters are rationalizing a yes vote because they believe this is just this once a situation. But as you pointed out, what are the chances that politicians who've enjoyed safe districts for 6 years are going to easily give them up in 2032? Just think about human behavior. I believe this is a nail in the coffin for an extremely popular voter-approved reform. The next emergency will be the expected loss of 4 to 5 congressional seats with the 2030 census. We'll need to fight back again. But imagine if the 282 million tax dollars that taxpayers are on the hook for this special election were spent not on political gamesmanship, but on issues Californians care about, like affordable housing. So we don't lose those congressional seats to population drain because no one can afford to stay here. And don't you wonder why Prop 50 is on the ballot when history tells us that the midterms will likely be a blue wave election that will likely flip 5 seats to the Dems in California anyway? I think the truth is that the legislature has been waiting for an excuse to get the power of the pen back. And Trump has now provided the pretext. Gerrymandering is so tempting for parties because it is cheaper and easier to cheat rather than to earn votes by running strong candidates who can speak to constituent issues and get voters to the poll. Democracy.
And Cynthia, you raise an interesting question of the upcoming census and the prospect that California could easily lose a handful of congressional seats with population changes. Eric, I'm curious, what your thoughts are on this notion of whether this is temporary, especially in light of the upcoming census. Do you have any thoughts about just how likely that might be?
Yeah, it's tough to say. There certainly is potentially an incentive to want to continue with a legislatively drawn map for all the reasons that Cynthia mentions. The one reason it might the commission might survive anyway is because the default condition is that we will return to the commission. So it would require most likely another ballot measure like this. And so the voters would have to agree to suspend the commission yet again, or maybe get rid of it entirely. Who knows? But I do think you can certainly imagine that the same arguments that people are making now might still seem compelling in a few years' time. So I would say that kind of both outcomes seem reasonable to me as possibilities, but I wouldn't say that's a slam dunk either way.
But either way, if this were to be extended, it would have to go back to voters again, right?
Yeah, I would. It would be hard to imagine how that couldn't be the case now that they've set the precedent of going to voters to get this thing in the first place. As I said, there was some discussion about a novel interpretation of the Constitution, of the California Constitution, where you wouldn't have to go to voters to make this change, and the legislature could just go ahead and draw the map. But at the very least, even that novel interpretation was premised on the idea that the commission would draw the maps in the first place, right after the census, and then you could draw whatever maps you wanted after the commission took its first crack at the problem. So I think one way or the other, the commission is either going to be drawing the maps at first in the 2030 cycle, or there's going to be another ballot measure to try to suspend it again.
And Cynthia also brought up the cost of this measure to taxpayers. Pastor Turner, do you want to respond to the cost or some of the other?
Yeah, because I think that's almost laughable that anytime they bring up the cost, we spent almost the same amount of money in a recall for Governor Newsom. Money is spent based on who's. It's so relative. This, to me, they want to count the cost of a recall election and talk about what the money can be used for. But the truth of the matter, the money wasn't being used for those things. And so this, to me, is a worthy cause to spend the money. It was not questioned when, like I said, when the Republican-led entity was trying to recall Governor Newsom, the dollars were spent. No one wanted to compare it then to programs and dollars that can be spent for teachers and kids, et cetera. I think the real cost comes in, like I mentioned earlier, with children that right now go hungry because their communities are drawn out of political power. And I think the cost shows up when working families' voices are silenced. And it's interesting that most of the opponents that speak out on it are people that can afford to wait 5 years for something to happen. And on November, if this wins, Trump will still be in office, but there will be an opportunity to send in some different voices into our Congress a little bit sooner that will actually be able to hopefully hold the line against some of the takeaways, some of the dismantling of programs that are basically making a difference between life and death for people. I think the people that are the minorities, those that are suffering, those that are socially or economically disadvantaged, I think it's them that we fight for, that doesn't have the luxury of waiting until the 2030 cycle and in hopes of who comes into office. And again, these maps are still drawn based on communities of interest. We know that. So we focus a lot on hyperpartisan, whether it's the Democrats, Republicans. For me, this is not about Dems, Republicans, or Newsom. It's about getting right voices, whoever those voices are going to be, that will hold the line and push back against what's happening in our nation.
And you brought up a whole bunch of different sort of policy considerations to deal with the Trump administration. And we're seeing that Democrats in this campaign are often making that argument that this is not just about, control of the House or the congressional maps. This is about, the National Guard, cuts to healthcare, all these different policy areas where Democrats disagree with what President Trump is doing. And Cynthia, I'm curious what you think of that notion. You mentioned earlier that you agree with some of the sentiments that the pastor has raised about concerns she has with the Trump administration. But why do you disagree with this notion of seeing this Prop 50 battle in that light? Is this not a way, as she was saying, to push back against some of those actions that are a concern from the Trump administration?
Yeah, as I said, this administration has shown a great willingness to stretch the boundaries of executive power and to completely bypass Congress. So, as I mentioned, he's already ignoring a Republican-led Congress. I don't really see why he's not going to continue ignoring a Democratic-led Congress. So I just think it's not an effective way to deal with presidential overreach. I agree that all of those issues are very real, but there are other ways that people are going to have to come up with to fight this president.
And also, you mentioned earlier the notion of the cost. I want to go back to that again. What about the cost? We're talking a couple $100 million, and as the pastor pointed out, a comparable amount was spent on the Newsom recall election. Do you want to say anything further on that? Of why is that in the scope of this many $billion state budget? Why is that cost such a focal point for you?
Well, as I said, I bring it up in terms of what if our legislature focused on governing and solving the kinds of issues that are leading to our loss of representative power due to population loss? That's the reason I bring that up. I also agree that, the recall elections are really expensive. That is a cost of direct democracy. But the difference is that this cost was imposed by the legislature. The recall and other things were brought by, sure, they might have been Republican-led groups, but they were brought by people. So that is one of the challenges of our direct democracy, is that anyone who is willing to organize and get enough votes can, in fact, bring that to the ballot.
I want to move on to the Voting Rights Act concerns here. But before we do that, Pastor Turner, any final thoughts on the cost or what we've just been talking about?
Yeah, just one quick, I think, distinction. I really always lean in and learn from Cynthia and others that are speaking, because I want to continue listening and hearing. And I think for me, the distinction is just that I don't agree so much that our Republican-led Congress is being bypassed by the Trump administration. They are in agreement and they sign to support what he's doing, as opposed to refuse to participate in it. So I do think that, and my hope and prayer is that there would be a difference with Democrats that would actually not agree, not show up to vote and support what he's pushing. That would be all.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about the Voting Rights Act considerations here. We're seeing in other states that minority opportunity districts for people of color are being broken up in these redistricting, gerrymandering processes. I'm curious how you all evaluate California's maps, and how good of a job would you say these maps do in terms of preserving those opportunity districts or minority majority districts in some cases. Let's start with Eric. How you sort of hinted at this earlier, but how would you rate these maps in terms of preserving that representation?
Yeah, I think so. We looked at how many majority voters of color districts there are, and that, as a practical matter, That means majority Latino. There's not really pockets of Black or Asian American populations that are large enough to draw majority congressional districts because congressional districts are pretty big. But there are plenty of opportunities to draw majority Latino districts, and this proposed map actually matches the existing map in terms of the number of majority Latino districts. There also are, we looked into this idea of an influence district or opportunity district where a particular group has a chance to sort of help decide the outcome in coalition with other groups. This is not necessarily a strictly Voting Rights Act thing, but it is something that you can sort of aim for, and is sometimes discussed in Voting Rights Act litigation. And there's no real hard and fast definition for what a district like that would be, but we said anywhere between 30 and 50% for that particular group. And if you use that definition, then again, there are about as many as before. There's a couple of Black influence districts. There's I think 6 Asian influence districts. And then there's actually one more Latino influence district than in the existing map. So the proposed map doesn't really change the status quo that much on that dimension. And that's why I say I guess I would be surprised if there was a Voting Rights Act lawsuit. It doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, but they seem to have been pretty careful when drawing this map to make sure that they were protected on that score.
Cynthia, how would you rate the maps in terms of protecting representation for people of color and other communities of interest? Yeah, you used the word disenfranchised earlier. Can you talk about more of your concerns in that sense?
Yeah, so not great. On the surface, it seems like they were careful about the majority minority districts as required by the Federal Voting Rights Act. So I agree with Eric's analysis there, but they absolutely did not respect communities of interest as required by our Constitution. Something that I'm very proud of, and I hope that Commissioner Turner is also proud of, is that we set the stage for representation that looks more like California. Since the commission was established, the percentage of women elected to the legislature has more than doubled. Asian American Pacific Islanders tripled. Blacks have almost doubled, and Latino legislators jumped by 8 points. But this is all at risk. The proposed map brings back the infamous, what I call named districts, and once again dilutes fast-growing Asian populations, splinters Black and brown neighborhoods, and combines urban and rural populations. For example, in Commissioner Turner's district, the so-called Stockton finger is back. It surgically cuts out Black and brown voters plus half of the Asian community from the heart of Stockton and lumps them with rural Modesto, Turlock, and Madera. And by the way, this district is one of the majority Latino districts that Prop 50 claims to have improved over the commission map. Because of course, suburban Latinos are just like rural ones. All brown voters are the same, right? Under the federal law, that is true. But we in California think about communities of interest. There's also a new Ribbon of Shame district that connects rural Modoc and Siskiyou counties to the Golden Gate Bridge. And both of the commissions separated the northern coast from inland agricultural communities because there aren't even roads that connect them. Parts of Sacramento's urban, Asian, and Black populations are sliced out now with mountain communities of Tahoe and Truckee. In general, the new map needlessly splits counties and cities, including really tiny communities. For example, the little city of Oakley, which has about 40,000 voters, was split in two. Davis, which has about 60,000 voters, was split in two. Lodi has about 60,000 voters. It was split in three. We always kept small communities of interest whole whenever possible to avoid diluting their voices. I mean, I could go on, but I should mention that another emergency that might be invoked in 2030 is the expected dismantling entirely of the Voting Rights Act in a case that's being heard right now at the Supreme Court, with rampant gerrymandering and no legal protections, neither party will be looking out for communities of color.
Pastor Turner, how would you rate these maps? And do you want to respond to some of these concerns about the geographic shape of districts and communities of interest being split up?
Yeah, but only minimally. I am, of course, in agreement with the statements that was made by Eric earlier, in that I think for sure the VRA was considered, was implemented. I think there are strong districts that are drawn. Our congressional districts are huge. And so anytime there is a shift or change to them, you will see changes in some of the smaller communities. Splits are not desirable by anyone. My hope is that in areas that have been split, it gives opportunity for additional representation with the right relationships that's being built. I know that there are areas that were put together more so on some of the community of interest dialogue or testimony as it relates to commuters. And there are some new partners that have never been together before. And there's not a lot of, I'm not in disagreement with a lot of what Cynthia has outlined. And with all of that, again, I still stand and believe that it is a worthy concession, even if hard. You got to start to balance. Do you look at some of the takeaways that we're seeing right now, the dismantling of programs and services and the disregard for urban communities, some of the harms that's come to our farming rural communities, or do we stand with representation? Because some of the representation that they've had has not represented them well anyway, either way. So this represents something that'll be new, that'll be a change. It may be uncomfortable. We will receipt for that. And I think still based on the hope for new representation that actually will listen to the smaller areas, the new part. I think everything's going to be relationship. There will have to be new relationships forged, built to be able to have the right type of representation. And with or without that happening, I think I still stand that the newer maps will broadly benefit California as a whole, and for sure our nation. That will be probably the largest benefit.
And we have a related audience question about this. We're going to get to more audience questions in a minute, but this one is very relevant to what we're just saying. So I wanted to pull it in now. And they want you to speak to these concerns that have been raised by the Farm Bureau about this notion that the map would weaken the voting power of people in districts that are currently have large portions of people that work in the agricultural industry. And the concern is essentially, I think, as I understand it, that the way the districts are drawn, those populations are lumped in with more urban centers to make the districts bluer, and then therefore, there's less representation for those farming communities. Pastor Turner, are you comfortable speaking more to that particular concern?
I want to just speak minimally because it's not an area that I have a lot of expertise in. What I do want to say just at a high level is in those areas, the farming areas, we'll need to forge new relationships. I think right now, our farming districts already, our farming areas and rural areas already have a lot of critique and issue and feel a lot of lack of representation. And I'm hopeful that, again, with new relationships built, that'll be a fresh start and something new for them.
Cynthia, do you want to speak to that question as well, that this concern about agricultural communities and rural districts?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the reason that we separated urban and rural areas. And I believe Commissioner Turner's commission also did that. Because the reason I talked about small communities is that we were very thoughtful about urban-rural divide, socioeconomic differences. So when we did split cities, we did so very intentionally. For example, in Oakland, we split the Oakland Hills from the lowlands because they have very different characteristics. And if you kept the city whole, money talks in our politics. Guess who is going to be listened to? Relationships are good to a point, but in the end, if you are running for office, you care about the relationships that are going to help you win the election. And so the concern, not only for communities of color, but also for rural communities, is that they're just going to get swamped out by dense urban areas and who is going to be listened to. It's all well and good to say, oh, but you have more representatives. But in practice, I find that never works. More splits is not a good thing. I mean, Fresno County being split into 6 is not good. They are not really going to get 6 representatives who care about their county, because actually all those representatives are going to be beholden to other parts of their districts that are much bigger, more powerful, and wealthier.
I have one more question before we get on to the audience questions here. And I for this question, I want to look down the road. It seems like this national redistricting war is not ending anytime soon. Eric was talking earlier about all the different states that are now taking part in this mid-decade gerrymandering. But I'm curious, do any of you see a viable off-ramp, and what sort of out do you hope could come to get us out of this escalating redistricting war? Eric, do you want to start with this one? What could the off-ramp be?
Yeah, it's tough to know in the near term what the off-ramp is. This redistricting fighting emerges from the fact that we are in one of the longest periods of close competition for the House between Democrats and Republicans since at least the Civil War, when the modern party system emerged. I mean, it's just really unprecedented to have 30 years of just very close competition, where the House is kind of always in play, and that really incentivizes this approach. Neither party is really able to develop a larger and broader coalition in American history when that has happened, and it has happened. There have been periods where the Republican Party was sort of dominant. There have been periods where the Democratic Party was dominant, and in those periods, redistricting is just not as much of an issue. So obviously, the most enduring way to have an off ramp would be for one party to just get a more enduring majority. That's not a very satisfying answer, I guess. The other way that you could get out of it is that Congress and the president are specifically authorized in the U.S. Constitution to regulate congressional elections. So there's no doubt whatsoever that if Congress and the president could agree, they could step in and they could provide guardrails that would constrain redistricting all over the country for Congress, not for state legislatures or city councils or whatever, but for Congress. And that's what's at issue here anyway. Obviously that's not likely to happen in the near term because Trump is the one who pushed for the change in Texas that kind of launched this whole thing in the first place. But there was a bill that was introduced by Democrats in a few years ago. That was H.R. 1. It was the very first bill that they introduced that contained a redistricting reform that would apply to most every state in the country and for their congressional elections. So this has been put on the table. The problem is that to get over the filibuster, you really need Democrats and Republicans to both agree that this is a step that needs to be taken. And it is certainly possible. I don't think it's totally crazy to think that both parties would sort of get fed up with this process if it spirals too far out of control, and might be willing to come together and agree on a set of rules that everybody has to abide by for congressional redistricting. I don't think that's totally crazy. I think it's somewhat crazy, I'll say, but it's not totally crazy, and that would be another realistic off ramp.
Cynthia, what is your hope for an off ramp here?
Well, if California is any indication, we cannot ask the fox to guard the hen house and take themselves out. So unfortunately, it's difficult to solve this at a national level, but there are many electoral reforms that would neutralize gerrymandering, such as proportional representation systems, ranked choice voting, open primaries. In California, we have a top 2 program for top 2 primary. There are top 4 and top 5 that are supposed to be even better. We already have many of these locally in San Francisco and other localities, and in some other states like Alaska. you know, I really do think that California does have a responsibility. That part I agree with Commissioner Turner, but I think it's through leadership, not by copying the worst gerrymanderer in the nation. By the way, the Prop 50 gerrymander would be number 2 in history, right after Texas, as the most extreme gerrymander if it passes. You know, I had the fortune of seeing our impact in California spread nationally because the first commission won a grant to share our model with our nation's most gerrymandered states. I personally traveled to Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and other commissioners went to, you know, Georgia, Utah, Colorado, and yes, Texas. So, you know, we supported Michigan's Independent Redistricting Commission. They copied us. Colorado, Virginia, and Utah also learned from the commission and adapted commissions for their states. My feeling is that California has always been a leader in expanding voting rights. In addition to the commission, we have same-day voter registration, we have DMV voter registration, we have a top 2 primary. Obviously, we have the recall, the referendum, the ballot initiative. In San Francisco, we love the recall here. So, you know, I think we win by leading others, not by copying the worst of the worst. Because the Supreme Court, you know, did not step up. They had the chance to stop partisan redistricting. And the Roberts Court chose to throw it back to the states. And so, unfortunately, we only have the option of fighting state by state. And we did see that California's leadership has made a difference. And I think it still can make a difference. And I think that's the only way that we're going to get out of this is to let California lead and have more states follow our lead.
Pastor Turner, what's your hope for an exit plan?
Yeah. So my hope would be, I love some of I love what Cynthia just brought up, because there was strong and pretty amazing work actually that the commissions both did. But the tour that she's talking about, going to all of the states, sharing the best of what was learned even during the first cycle. And I believe they were received in with open arms. People listened, had questions. There was a lot that was shared. And yet we're where we are today because of HR 1 and others. There were other proposals as well that were lifted, I believe, for the most part by Democratic leaders that were shot down by Republicans that had an opportunity to make this a nationwide independent redistricting commission for our states, each of the individual states. It didn't happen. So my hope for where we are right now is indeed through leadership, but also through the removal of fear for something new. She listed a few different opportunities for a new way of leadership. I think that we need to understand the times that we're in and be willing to go back to the table to say, how do we ensure that democracy nationwide continues to move forward and that it's not dismantled? And I think that there should be no areas that we're afraid to look at. So my hope is leadership, conversation, trying to see what's best for the whole of our nation, not just pockets or small groups of people, not just money and power, and to have that conversation and be willing to do something that may be what we've not seen before, but all on the basis of what will be beneficial and best for our democracy. I think there's no off-road. I think we'll have to continue on this journey until we find something that works for our nation.
Okay, so we're going to spend the last 10 or so minutes here taking questions from the audience. And some of these questions are directed at you, some of you individually. And so we'll kind of jump around a little bit. And the first one for Eric, this questioner is asking, isn't California already gerrymandered? What would you say to someone who thinks California already seems to be kind of gerrymandered before Prop 50?
Yeah, so that's an argument you heard, especially from Governor Abbott of Texas, saying that California already has a gerrymander, and the comparison there, actually, I think J.D. Vance maybe said the same thing, and the that idea comes from the fact that right now the Democrats in California are overperforming in the map that we have. So the Democrats have 43 seats, and that's a lot for the vote share that they got in the last election. They won 3 seats that they picked up by extremely narrow margins. It's like about 8,600 votes across those 3 districts had switched out of 15, 16 million casts statewide, had switched, then those 3 seats would have been lost, right? And would have gone Republican. So what really is the distinction between, say, California and Texas is that California's plan has competitive seats, and Texas's the plan they used in 2024 and 2022 does not. So the Texas Republicans, when they drew their map, it seems like they were concerned that they were going to lose support in Texas. And so they drew a very uncompetitive map that really had no opportunities to win any extra seats for them. And then they gradually picked up support in Texas. So they've done better in 2022 and 2024 than they did in 2020. And there was nothing for them to gain. And so they actually kind of boxed themselves in. In California, we have this much more competitive map. And so there were really opportunities for Democrats to get lucky, right? And to claim some of these really narrow wins. And that has given them, there's no question right now, the seat share that Democrats have in California is pretty out of proportion with the vote share they're getting. The difference is that those seats are also very fragile, right? They could be lost pretty easily. Maybe not in the next election, but in some point in the future. And what the new plan does along the way of also adding some additional Democratic seats is it shores up those seats that were just barely won, so that there's no chance of losing them again.
So you still got to run the campaign essentially if it's a competitive district. There's
right, yeah, and there's always the opportunity for luck in politics, and I think you could make the case that those were they're great candidates. I don't want to take anything away from them, but also when the margin is that narrow, it could easily have gone the other way.
Yeah. The next question here is for Cynthia, and this questioner cites a column in the San Francisco Standard where Adam Lashinsky, a columnist and editor over there, he wrote that he dislikes everything about Prop 50, but he's going to vote for it anyway because, quote, "This is no time to stand on principle. If this bad idea has even a small potential to restrain Donald Trump, it's worth doing." Cynthia, how do you respond to that sentiment from Adam Lashinsky?
Well, I'd like to follow up what Eric said. I think Eric's done some analysis that shows that there are, about a dozen competitive seats in California. So I want to point out that is more than twice the number of seats that the California is trying to gerrymander. My feeling is this is one of the reasons that I think Prop 50 is so ineffective. If the goal really is to win more seats, run good campaigns, flip all those districts. Some of them were really by a hair. And that is the amazing thing about California is we have these extremely competitive districts that are fair. They were drawn with respect of communities of interest, and they still go back and forth. And this is actually a question that came up in one of the interviews that I did, and something that Commissioner Turner mentioned that, maybe some of these rural areas are not getting very good representation right now. Well, in California, you can vote the bums out. That is possible in a competitive district. In gerrymandered districts, all the seats are safe, and it's extremely difficult to vote the bums out if you don't like the kind of representation that you are getting. So to me, a far more effective strategy than trying to cheat your way to power is to win legitimately, because there are so many more competitive districts that are up for grabs that are just waiting for candidates who can speak to the issues that these communities care about. And then those districts will flip. And as I've mentioned before, there's a very good chance of that, historically, in the midterms. So, I don't think it will have the kind of impact that people are hoping for. So.
Trina, what do you think about that sentiment of, just saying the sentiment of why not just fight out competitive districts and try to gain seats that way? Could that be I guess, a conceivable route as well to push back against President Trump?
That is a route. And I think the route that we're taking is not so much a cheat, is that it's legitimized by the people that show up to use their voices to vote. I think that brings legitimacy to the process. And I think this is, I agree with the person that asked the question. I sit in the camp that any and everything that is legal, because I think this would be legal since we put it to the voices of the Californians, I think would be the right route to take. I don't think we can stand safe in what has happened in the past. I think we should be trying what we can to basically regain our democracy.
We have another question here from someone wondering why Arnold Schwarzenegger has not weighed in more, even though he opposes Prop 50. And I can speak a little bit to this from my reporting. And, what we found is that even though Governor Schwarzenegger, played a key role in creating the commission, he had a meeting with Governor Newsom, and Governor Newsom went down to LA and met with Arnold at his home for about an hour. And, really kind of Newsom really asked him to stay on the sidelines, is what we found in my reporting. And even though, Newsom's a Democrat and Arnold's a Republican, they have a shared dislike of Donald Trump. And I think Newsom really tried to appeal to Schwarzenegger over that shared dislike. And so I think that's why we've seen Arnold kind of very tacitly oppose the initiative. He only spoke about it once at USC, and the opposition campaign has been using that footage and quotes from that speech to cut their ads. But Arnold isn't actually showing up and filming ads or actively campaigning. So I think that answers that question. Does anyone have any thoughts about why we're not seeing more of Arnold on the campaign trail? No, I don't. Seems to be the central celebrity here. And Cynthia, I'm sure you got to work with him a lot in the past.
He told us that we outpulled him. So, that's all I can say.
Gotcha. Well, I think that wraps up all our questions. Thank you all so much for a great discussion. Eric McGee, Pastor Trina Turner, and Cynthia Dye. This has been an excellent discussion. I appreciate you all making time for it today. If you want to follow more events from the Commonwealth Club and upcoming programs for in-person and virtual events, you can find out about them at commonwealthclub.org. I'm Dustin Gardner. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.